Mental Intelligence Podcast. I'm Dave Ford, your host, here with the Ocean Plastics Leadership Network. And I'm here with my old friend, Andrew Winston, who very recently just put out his newest book, Net Positive, with former Unilever CEO Paul Polman. Hey, Andrew, how are you?
I'm good, man. It's good to see you. We have not talked in a while, I think. It's good to see you quasi live.
Quasi live. Here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while. Like I guess we've reconnected over the course of the last couple months, and I know that you've just been head down writing this book for a really long time, and it's really exciting. I loved it. Can you give us an update of just how it's been since you launched a couple months ago?
Yeah, it's been exciting. I mean, books they have a long tail, hopefully. I guess if you've got one you think that kind of really reaches people, it can take a while till it really starts to build momentum because people have to actually go read it before they'll talk about it and tell others. And as you know, everyone's busy and getting people to read something like a book is tough. I don't read as many books as I'd like. But, we came out in October. Paul Polman and I have been, doing talks and podcasts and recording things, daily, literally for the last few months. And what's exciting for me is that it's a really global book. I mean, partly for obvious reasons that Paul's Dutch and British, and so it's selling extremely well in Holland, not surprisingly in the Netherlands, but it's just selling in India and Japan and Brazil, and and this is the English version so far, and we're going to come out with tons of translations over the next year. So I'm just excited to see it kind of going global, and our hope is that this is a movement that we've started the conversation to kind of push the ambition level that companies have to be net positive, which means to have a positive impact through everything they do on all the people that they impact, all the people that they touch. And it's a tough agenda. It's not an easy task, but I think we need that level of ambition now if we're going to solve the really big problems.
Well, I think Paul is a legend, a corporate legend. Do you
Yeah.
like the way he entered the scene at Unilever and sort of bucked the system traditionally? How did you guys start working together?
Well, he reached out to me. I mean, I knew him a little bit. I had worked with Unilever in North America for a number of years on their sustainability advisory board, and I met him. And he had read my previous book, The Big Pivot, and I think gave it out to top few hundred people in the company, and had read my stuff. And obviously, I knew who he was. But he reached out to me. It was Climate Week in 2019, and we had dinner and with Jeff Seabright, who's his kind of right hand guy, who's done so much great work. He was at Coke for a long time, and then at Unilever, and then left kind of with Paul when Paul retired from Unilever. And basically Paul said, everyone's pushing me to write a book. They have been for a long time, and I never really wanted to. He kind of felt like he's a very humble guy, and he kind of felt like it was a big ego trip to do a CEO book. But he realized that so many people were asking him, like, how do I do it? Okay, I get it. We got to do more. How do I do more like Unilever? And he, really wanted to put something out that is, can get to a lot more people than just him talking to someone, that you can reach all these companies at once. And they knew and liked my writing. So they asked me to, write it with them and kind of bring my 20 years in the field to the table and kind of my ability to synthesize and, kind of pull things together. He's a really big thinker with tons of thoughts, and kind of turning that into a linear story was really, my main job. And it was really fascinating work. We spent a couple years writing it, and I think it came out. I'm happy with it. People seem to be, reading it and enjoying it. And that's all I can ask for.
Amazing. And in the op-ed that you and Paul co-wrote for Harvard Business Review not too long ago, you mentioned that society's expectation of a business have changed more in the last 2 years than in the previous 20. And you also mentioned that we've reached the end of the beginning. I mean, this is
Yeah.
like music to my ears. Can you deep dive a little bit about what you meant by that?
Yeah. I mean, I this is kind of the way I've been talking about this for a number of months now, is that the last 2-3 years have really been kind of remarkable, because for those of us that have been doing this a while, I have been in this 20 years now, which is shocking to me. On some level, there was motion, there was movement. Companies got, gradually more engaged. But you could argue that, we failed, right? I mean, the bottom line is emissions are still up. So on the climate issue, we haven't won yet. But somehow in the last couple of years, there were no large companies left that were really fighting that sustainability should be on the agenda. There's a huge range of how committed they are, how much they understand what the agenda means, but everyone's at the table finally. And I think there's a lot of reasons that we kind of hit that tipping point. And that's what I mean by the end of the beginning. We've now got everyone. All the big companies in the world are talking about it. almost all put out a sustainability report, almost all have goals of some kind. A quarter of them have science-based targets, and that's got to rise fast, but but it's moving. And there were a number of things that came together. I think the pandemic accelerated a lot of what was happening, but there were these kind of once in a lifetime moments, like the killing of George Floyd all of a sudden brought racial equity to the top of the corporate agenda, and every business felt like they had to do something, say something. And it's always hard to say why these tipping points happen. But on the kind of mega trends of climate inequality, I think companies just started to feel it. Like, climate change is no longer a model to debate about what's going to happen. It's happening, and companies are feeling it. They're seeing the expense. Their supply chains are screwed up. The extreme weather is devastating, and so it's just now happening, and they're realizing they have to do something about it. So I think we're kind of in an exciting time where the agenda is being set now by a lot of companies. And again, that's why we wanted this to be out now, to try to push a much more aggressive agenda as companies come to this and take it on for real.
It's interesting, like the work that we've embarked on our ocean plastics journey that culminated in that ship in the middle of the Atlantic Gyre, where we brought all these stakeholders that really don't like each other together to learn from each other, this like positional understanding thing. I think it's really interesting because we've helped activist groups realize that a lot of times they're fighting battles from like 5 years ago and 10 years ago, where like there's the needle, the things are moving, and not as fast as the activist groups would like them to, but they're definitely like moving from the corporate sector at a much faster click.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of speaks to what you're talking about here. Like, what the last 2 years, has been significant. I mean, this COP, I think I was there. I know that you were following it really closely.
Yeah.
What were your takeaways there? I mean, I think there's like equal part, like, wow, we've like made huge strides, and we have, we actually mentioned coal in text, which is shocking that they haven't done that for 26 years.
They did back down at the end, right? They were kind of saying we got to get away from coal, and then they couldn't. They kind of felt like they couldn't continue saying that. Look, I think, like all the COPs, on some level, it's always amazing that 190 countries can come together and agree on anything, right? I mean, in some sense, the Paris Accord is an amazing moment in human history, and there was improvement in some of the goals, right? I think if countries hit the goals they've now set, I think the estimate is we can maybe hold warming to 1.8, 1.92 degrees. I mean, that's a big if, right? And India set an end point for carbon for the first time. It's further out than we'd like, but they set one. So again, like it's the kind of same thing. Everyone's at the table, but at the same time, it's also what came out of it is also woefully inadequate versus the science, versus how fast things are changing. I mean, we're really not on track to cut emissions in half by 2030. I mean, let's be honest, they're still rising. It's not 2022. We got the 1.5 degree report in 2018 and said we got 11, 12 years, and here we are, we got 8. And so it's hard not to feel like they're not, as people are saying now, that people aren't looking up, from the Netflix movie, that they're not really looking at how serious this is and how fast we have to go. And everyone's kind of still being careful around the fossil fuel industry. I mean, one thing that worried me about the COP meeting was the sector, the industry with the most representatives there was fossil fuels. That's not a good idea at the COP meeting, because the real movement on climate is going to make fossil fuels irrelevant. I mean, we have to stop burning them, right? And there's really no sequestration or other technologies that are going to make that not true, that we're going to mainly move away from fossil fuels. So having them be represented there is a little odd. And it makes me think they'll continue to slow progress. So, there's good news, but I think it leaves this big gap for companies. As usual, I kind of come back to the private sector and say, companies got to step up and lead, and go faster than governments. And I think they can. And the leaders are.
Yeah. It's interesting. Have you tracked with Tezpora Berman and her advocacy on the fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty?
No, that's a cool idea. I haven't seen that.
It's getting a lot of movement. I was definitely in some circles in COP where, they're really pushing and advocating, but there's just like, there's no way else unless there's a non-proliferation treaty, which obviously is like pretty politically divisive for a lot of different ways in a lot of different sectors for obvious reasons. But her TED Talk is amazing. I'll send it to you.
Yeah. I'll check
Really,
it out.
really powerful. She's not
Well, it is a
Canadian.
mutually assured destruction thing, right? It's the same thing as nuclear. I mean, we did as a species so far not use these weapons since they were used once, right? Or twice, but in one time period. And that's kind of amazing, right? We kind of agreed not to, and we still haven't. I don't know why we can't. It's a good idea to put it in those terms. Like, how do we make an agreement to get away from burning fossil fuels and move to new technologies, which we have, as fast as we can, and faster.
Were you tracking with the big finance announcements that came out
Yeah,
of COP as well? Because that's been really pretty fascinating.
it's
The
been
GFAM,
interesting.
a lot of money being pledged. What's your take on all that? How do you
Yeah.
feel?
Well, I mean, I said before that we kind of at the end of the beginning, I think the last straw, actually, the last kind of Jenga piece or whatever before the denial tower fell was finance. I think was the investment community, and not just the institutional investors, but the investment community coming to the table, starting to pressure companies in their analyst meetings with CEOs and CFOs. I mean, that's happening, and starting to really look at their footprint. I mean, for years, the message from those of us kind of pushing for sustainability in business has been, hey, look, banks, it's great if you look at your flying of your employees, or look at, copying and digital billing, but it's where your money goes is the entirety of your footprint, and you're still funneling money to fossil fuels. And so that they're at least kind of acknowledging that now, putting out goals for their portfolios to have, carbon-free portfolios. It's a start. I, the problem is a lot of those goals, most of them right now, I think, are like 2050. Like, they'll stop financing fossil fuels by 2050 when they finance infrastructure, things that get built that last for decades. So to really hit the targets, you have to stop financing it kind of now, right? So it's a little bit like, again, it's like India coming to the table. At least the banks are there, and they're pledging some really big money of their own spending on both clean tech and on social sustainability, racial equity, affordable housing, on and on. Those kinds of announcements of putting real money behind the progress, I think, are almost more important than the commitments to make their portfolio zero someday. When they get those commitments kind of more close to today and really put some teeth in them, then there'll be something. But it's again, everyone's at the table. It's a start. We've got everyone talking about it and realizing they have to do something.
I guess better late than never.
Yeah.
Interesting. I watched that Planetary Boundaries, Breaking Boundaries with David Attenborough, and
Yeah.
have you watched that on Netflix?
No, but I mean, look, the
It's
boundaries is the bottom line of all this, right? The thresholds is what's driving all of this conversation. But
we
I haven't seen that
Well, I
one.
mean, it's just like so much. It just reinforces like it's the 2020s. Like
Yeah,
it's now.
yeah.
It's us right now that are
Right now.
working. Like we got to figure it out in a hurry, right?
Yeah.
And it's just so complicated and so complex. And I mean, yeah, you talk climate, and then you talk the intersections with plastics and deforestation,
Yeah.
and I mean, all regenerative, all these overlaps. But I mean, and climate is like in the center of this sort of complex Venn diagram. And
Yeah.
finance specifically, I'm fascinated by the finance piece because I think it's just so confusing. And the
Yeah.
conversation that we've had with lots of folks that work in finances, they're just as confused trying to figure it out from the inside. There's just so
Yeah.
much different parties, so much
Yeah.
leverage. Like in a recent article, you wrote about an ESG tug of war set to take place in
Yeah.
2002. So I'd love to
Yeah.
dive with you a little bit more. How
Yeah.
do you expect that to play out?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a downplaying what's going on now. So that was my kind of year-end review, and wrote it kind of mid-December. And even since then, there's been some important articles that have come out. There was one, I think it was in Bloomberg, the Mirage of ESG. There's been this rush of money, and it's estimated half of all assets will be in some form of responsible investing, ESG investing. And by the way, everyone's using the phrase ESG now. Everyone's talking about it in business. People are starting to put out ESG reports instead of sustainability reports. And again, that's because of finance. That's because that's the term they use. That, I think, is not great in many ways. I mean, ESG it's a pretty, it's just an acronym, right? It just means environmental, social, and governance. It's kind of like just saying HR. It doesn't tell you anything about the strategy of that. It doesn't tell you anything. Like the word sustainability tells you something about what you're shooting for, or regenerative, right? Or net positive. So I kind of don't love that ESG has become the phrase, because it's putting it in terms of just what the finance community likes. And let's be honest, like what the finance community wants and the obsession with short-term shareholder value got us into this mess. So I don't really want the finance community setting kind of the agenda. But so there's this pushback coming from the sustainability folks that are kind of knowledgeable, and just the fact that it's really unclear in all these supposed ESG funds, how are they screening? What data are they using? And there's metrics out there, but they're really undeveloped. It's anarchy. So I think you're already seeing some backlash against all these funds saying this is an ESG fund, and people going, okay, wait a minute, what does that mean?
What
How
is
do you know
that?
that?
Yeah.
How
Well,
do you
and
know the
Gary
companies
Gensler,
are
Gary
doing
Gensler
better?
getting
Right.
involved, right? I mean, you're
Yeah.
starting to like look at regulators that are looking at this and be like, wait a
Right.
second, it's just a giant greenwash. Like,
Right.
what are
You got to put some definitions around. And that Mirage article basically said that MSCI, one of the big raters, that they define whether a company's kind of good on ESG based on whether the kind of mega trends and the thresholds affect them and their business, not the other way around. So it's like, how much risk is there to this business from climate change? So if they think it's low, they'll say this is a good investment for ESG no matter what they're doing. And so that's kind of backwards, right? And so there's people saying this is kind of BS right now. We got to define this in a way where the companies that we're calling leaders are actually moving towards smaller footprint and improving the well-being of everybody that they impact. That's much harder to measure. And we're working on that, in our net positive team to kind of come up with metrics and kind of a standard around this. But there's just going to be a lot of argument about it, and it's necessary. We need to hold, all these funds, all these people saying they're doing ESG to account, and make sure that we know what they say and they know what they're saying.
you mentioned shareholder value metrics, and I wasn't one of the chapters in the book Milton Friedman is dead or something
Yeah,
like
it was
that?
just a box. It should have been a whole chapter. We thought about naming the book that, but a lot of people said that kind of grabbed them.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, this is a philosophy. He's dead.
He is dead.
There's no killing off Milton Friedman. He's dead. But like, how do we kill off his philosophy? I mean, which is just ingrained in every CFO in the world right now. There's no escaping it, right?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I've been thinking a lot in recent year or two about narrative and story, and how embedded the story is that companies are supposed to pursue shareholder value above all. And it's part of a larger story, kind of the neoliberal view of the world that says, freedom above all, low taxes. It's not just the company level; it's at the country level, right? The metric that matters is GDP, or the stock market, right? It's not measures of well-being. It's not infant mortality rates or lifespans or how many people are healthy, right? It's just the dollar figure, and that's always been warped. And I think the way you get away from it is partly that we have to tell a new and better story. And that sounds kind of highfalutin, but you have to show that the new story works, and that the people pursuing it, the companies pursuing it, do better, are happier people, are more functional companies that attract great employees, and customers love them. That there's just all these benefits to going down this path, in addition to saving the planet and making it so it's kind of livable for us, which seems like a pretty good macro reason. You have to kind of show that it's better. And I think it's very difficult to go against this very ingrained story and the kind of terminology that we use, but we have to just kind of relentlessly tell a different one and show that it's a better way.
I think you identify the 5 core principles of a net positive company, and obviously using Unilever as the framework. Where would you say this? Obviously it's very different sector by sector, but like where are we versus in your mind versus where we need to go? Like, I know the beginning, right? We're at the beginning. There's definitely progressive companies out there. We're involved with the plastics treaty, the global plastics treaty, right? And there's definitely really progressive companies that are out there calling for virgin reductions. You'd be like, some of the biggest multinationals in the world are calling for virgin reduction. You would have never thought that in a million years. So like, things are happening, and they're pegged to these 2050 massive 2050 goals that they don't see any way that they're going to hit unless they take these huge steps. But like, where, I know it's a big question, but like, or are there other like companies that you think are like really exciting you in addition to Unilever? What
Well, there's
Unilever?
nowhere near enough, right? I mean, we have a kind of list in the book of big companies that people have heard of that have done some really good things. You know, the privately held ones, the longtime leaders like Patagonia and Interface and IKEA. Um, you know, there's big, mostly kind of European companies, DSM, or there's Natura in South America. There's companies scattered all over the world that have really good stories and have done, I think, a lot. And sometimes, you know, parts of their business or part of what they do are really net positive. They're really causing a positive impact. You know, IKEA makes more, you know, buys and produces more renewable energy than it needs. So it's actually net positive, and it's selling renewable energy to customers as well. I mean, they're pushing to have a much bigger impact. You know, so there's plenty of stories, but I mean, you know, like the companies that we talk about, they kind of come up over and over again. It's kind of been a very similar list for years, and it's not enough, right? It has to expand pretty rapidly to be everybody. So you know, where are we? I think, you know, the end of the beginning is good, as I've said, but we're late, right? I mean, we have so little time, and we have to move companies so fast to a really different way of thinking about their purpose and what their goals should really be. And the core principles that you mentioned that we talk about in the book, I mean, there's a few, but it's about taking a long-term view and serving multiple stakeholders, you know, trying to maximize the outcome for your customers and employees and suppliers and communities, and then serving shareholders or investors because you've done the first stuff right, not the other way around, not putting shareholders first. That's a big leap, right? I mean, as we just talked about, it's a different story. And it's, you know, the core principle is taking ownership, taking responsibility for the impacts you have all over the world. Kind of what we teach our kids, right? You break it, you own it. Companies need to take more ownership of how they affect the world. These are hard leaps. So I think, you know, it's hard to say where we are. More's happened in the last 2 years than I would have expected. There's been things that I even have been surprised at when companies jumped into, you know, politics in a way they never had. After the insurrection, the coup attempt in the US a year ago, a bunch of companies pulled money from just one party, just the people who had voted to overturn the election. They didn't usually do that, or that was very unusual. And a bunch of companies went back to supporting those, but a bunch have stayed away. And that's kind of new. I didn't even expect that, for them to jump in that way. So companies are engaged in so many issues now, and it's a tough road to figure out what to say, when to jump in, but they have to. You know, that the expectations are high. So I think, again, we're in a good place that everybody's there. Everybody's realizes they have to have a stance on racial equity, right? On inequality, on climate. That's the real beginning.
I think it's interesting, like what we're finding, I would say, like just to speak broadly and not specifically, we have 140 organizations are in the Ocean Plastic Leadership Network now. Of those, offhand, I would say like 50 or Fortune 500, like some of the biggest companies in the world, a lot of producers, some petrochemical companies, some consumer packaged goods companies. And we are so lucky that if you just imagine each of these companies as a 100-year-old aircraft carrier, which in most cases they are,
Yeah.
we're working with the folks that are on board that are trying to turn these aircraft carriers around. Then it takes a really long time, you know, and like, what's the catalyst to just turn them on a dime? I mean, yeah, you need a Paul Polman, you know, as the captain. You need that to happen from the top. But a lot of times it's happening, you know, at you know, whether it's a chief sustainability officer or whether it's a chief procurement officer, or like someone that understands the nuances of just how these gigantic machines work. And there's just these champions. I mean, that's what I get excited about, is like, even at some of the biggest, I would say, companies that don't have the most stellar reputations because of their sheer size and the way they're forced to do business by Milton Friedman's philosophy. There are these like leaders that are doing stuff inside these trying everything and taking risks.
Yeah.
And that's exciting.
But part of the challenge about where we are is that there are these big companies that are aircraft carriers. They have vested interests. So, and there's always a tendency we have of like basically kind of supply side solutions. Like, okay, we've got a carbon problem. You know, Bill Gates is saying we got to go invest in finding fusion. We got to just find a way to make everything the kind of energy we make in a totally green way. Or we got to, do less virgin plastic. So we'll just, make things out of different materials, right? Instead of, more really fundamental questioning of packaging, of energy use, having like things like the bin stores where you don't have packaging at all. And the
Yeah,
problem is a lot
reuse
of the
and
big
reuse
guys,
and refill, right?
I mean, and that's happening, right? There's people experimenting with it, but it's a tough road because there's a bunch of companies where that eliminates their product. And so, again, it's like fossil fuels companies being involved in the climate discussion. It goes against their direct interests, not in the larger sense of, again, a planet that we can thrive on, but in their direct, immediate, short-term interests, it goes against them. So it's a challenge, right? We have to sometimes create new ways of doing things around the current entrenched players, and that's tough too.
It's just it's so tricky on so many fronts. I
Yeah.
think another thing that you said that was that I thought was really interesting was just allowing and this is like who we are, like fundamentally, like what we've created, to some degrees by accident, but we've been able to add a ton of value, is to embrace deep partnerships, even with critics. Um, I just love that. I love that idea. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit? That's
Yeah, I
certainly
mean,
like
we
how we've been able to add so much value.
yeah, I mean, Paul and I we were, as we hashed out so many ideas in the book, we were talking about kind of keeping in the back of our heads the super critical folks, the Anand Giridhas's, the guy who wrote Winners Take All, that are really skeptical of business and the current system, as I just talked about, and that it really kind of protects the billionaires and protects the oligarchy. And we started to kind of think through a framework of, who are you working with as a business? We're suggesting strongly and saying you have to work in partnership with civil society, with government. So we kind of laid out in, kind of a box in the book, the different kinds of critics. There's going to be ones that are really knowledgeable about a topic, and can be really productive if they come in knowing more about plastics or electronics recycling or whatever it is than you can work with them, right? There's the kind of single issue guys who just focus in on, say, like animal testing, and these are really complicated issues, and sometimes they're super narrow focused and it's hard to engage on the kind of connected issues. But then there's just cynics, and the cynics, both inside a company and outside, just basically say companies suck, we can't trust you, you're this cause of the problem. And that's not productive, right? There's no point really in engaging with them in any serious way, because they're not coming to the table to try to work to solutions. They're just coming to say, you're the problem. And so I think understanding who you're working with as a business, who you're talking to, and whether you're really just talking to a cynic, is kind of an important step. And then you can be more kind of open to inviting in the critics that are helpful. And Unilever's done this probably better than almost any company, of working with Greenpeace, working with labor unions, having incredibly good relationships with them. And those organizations will work on one issue with them. Like Greenpeace has worked with them on issues directly, and then separately hung a banner on a building like they do about some other issue, that they're doing, that they think they're doing wrong. So they can do both, right? And I think that's, in a way, a good relationship, that the NGOs stick to their guns, and know what they believe, but are willing to work with the guys that are being open, transparent, and clearly want to do something.
It's interesting you mentioned Greenpeace. They, we've been they were on that ship with
Yeah.
us in the middle of the Atlantic Gyre, and we've been working with them on the global plastic treaty convenings that we've been doing. And these people that I mentioned, these champions on the aircraft carriers, like I mean like across the board, when I have conversations with them off the record, they're like, wow, this thing that Greenpeace just did really helped move. They really got the
Yeah.
attention of our board when they dressed
Yeah.
up in orangutan costumes and showed up at the board meeting,
Yep.
to talk about palm oil and issues that we have in Southeast Asia and all this. Like they've been able to help move
Yeah.
these air.
No, they're
Greenpeace is
critical.
good at moving aircraft carriers. That's
Yeah.
I don't think maybe refer to themselves like that, but
Right.
that's the truth.
They're
Productive,
critical.
yeah, totally. And productive criticism. I just like that. I just like that. I like that. Do you have any other examples off the top of your head? Of productive criticism.
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest story in the book, kind of speaking of Greenpeace again, is really in a way, the story we build to in the book is about palm oil. And I went into this thinking, it's going to be tough to talk about palm oil. It's a failure. It's something that companies like Unilever take such grief for. And Paul was so eager to talk about it. And I, learned a lot about it and talked to, folks at like World Business Council, World Economic Forum, talked to Greenpeace, that, the big companies, the big buyers of palm oil, and palm oil is in like, food, soaps, I mean, everything that we use in our lives. And it's a huge cause of deforestation because people are going to cut down forests to grow palm oil in Indonesia and Malaysia. And the big guys, Unilever and P&G and others, they've been pushing and had these goals, to have responsibly sourced palm oil, but deforestation rates kept going up. It was basically a failure. But in the last kind of 4 years, the rate of deforestation in Indonesia actually came down. It's one of the bright spots. And you might have heard about it at COP because it's one of the few bright spots in this fight. And the reason is, I mean, there's lots of reasons, but one of them that's important is they started doing, the much bigger kind of systems partnerships. So you had the big buyers like Unilever and Procter and Gamble, the farmers, the smallholder farmers at the table, municipalities, the government, Greenpeace and NGOs that have knowledge of the growing methods, of the ways to do it in a more sustainable fashion, and the banks, finance, the Norwegian sovereign fund, put in money so that this is a project going on in Indonesia so that the farmers can get better species, better practices, and have the financing to hold off in the maybe two growing seasons it takes to move to new species. You have to have this time. And so instead of going to cut down the forest next door, they're making their own farms much more productive. And it's working. It's working, but it's hard work. And it's at the local level. And it means listening to Greenpeace and having them at the table. And it means Greenpeace not just walking in and saying, everyone stop using palm oil, which is not a particularly useful thing. I mean, it's in so many products, but also millions of people are farmers, right? It's like there's a huge problem if you just leave that product on the well-being side of the sustainability, on the social side. And so wouldn't it be better to find a way to do it sustainably? I think that's the goal that these big companies have now. So anyways, having the whole system at the table is what finally made the difference. And that's hard work, but I think much more rewarding.
You mentioned Don't Look Up earlier.
Yeah.
For those of you who may not have seen it, we won't give anything away. I totally loved it. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah. I mean, look, the problem is, I mean, I live this life, right? It's kind of depressing if you really spend too much time in the climate space because the news is not great, and you have to have these breaks. And the frustration. I mean, without giving too much away, the movie's about a meteor coming at the planet, and it's a metaphor for climate change. And basically, these scientists can't get people to listen. I mean, that's painful to watch because that is what we've been doing. That's what scientists have been doing and haven't been listened to, really, right? There's this whole claim of alarmism. You're being alarmist. It's like, well, some things are alarming, and maybe we should be alarmed. And there's been such pushback from the, vested interests that try to demean it, say you're being emotional, like, they find various ways. And how frustrating that is for everybody in the field, right? That the problem is very serious. We should take it very seriously. And you got a bunch of people saying, oh, it's not a problem. They started with it's a hoax. They've moved mostly away from that, but there's still it's not as big a problem, or it is, but it's too expensive to fix, which is completely reversed, right? Completely opposite. It's too expensive to let this keep happening. And it's much cheaper now to solve it.
The insurance companies are starting to pay attention. That's for sure. Do you know Katharine Hayhoe by chance?
Yeah. I don't know her personally, but I follow her work, and she's such an interesting Venn diagram of life, herself of scientist, Texas, evangelical, it's just such a fascinating mix, and she can reach people that, I think others can't.
She's coming on the podcast next week, and she's like my superhero because she is like, she's from Canada, which I think is a superpower, right? Because she can kind of she doesn't have to get too entrenched in the politics here, but she's Christian. She's married to a pastor. She lives in Texas. She goes into conservative churches and talks about climate change.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that's what needs to happen. Right. And she just has this like framework about how to talk about climate change, like on an interpersonal level, that I think is so incredibly important. And like that, I mean, I do think we've come certainly a long way in a lot of places, but there are still like 7% of the people out there that are just staunch climate deniers that anything you write, they're going to come out. I imagine you get some pretty interesting Twitter comments from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can. I try not to go into replies, and in a way, social media, Twitter, it's kind of a cesspool, right? I mean, it gets ugly.
Mean
There's
tweets.
definitely triggers. If you say something, I made a comment once. Elon Musk was talking about digital currency, and there's a lot of indications and evidence that these cryptocurrencies require a ton of energy, right? They're just a growing problem. And I made a point, and boy, you don't want to piss off the crypto boys out there. Like the attacks on Twitter, you don't know what you're talking about. It was just brutal. So, and yeah, the climate deniers are out there, and there's a lot that are bots that are, kind of placed to come say. But, I'll tell you, I have found, again, in this last couple of years in particular, the denial level within companies where it really matters, or within governments, is close to nil. I mean, I'm sure there's still people who believe from the propaganda they've heard that it's overblown, or it's a liberal plot to take over and control you. But they've gotten much, much quieter in business because their CEOs talking about it, their customers are asking, the investors are walking in and asking, new employees want to know. You can't be a denier anymore. I mean, you have to work really hard to deny what's going on. I mean, it's because it's just happening, right? It's out there. So I think that denial has really dropped, but they've moved from denial to other things, like the whole it's too expensive, right? It costs too much, or it's regressive. It'll hurt people if we do something about it. I mean, they've found other arguments to try to undermine action. And so we have to keep, knocking those down.
That's the truth. And I mean, there's I mean, it's interesting too that you brought up the crypto thing. We've been studying that, like getting into the finance, really deep diving on the finance side of things. There's like different types of cryptocurrency and different types of energy for different types of cryptocurrency. There's also, I think, a point to be made, which is interesting. Like I've really gone into this, really trying to understand this I'm just doing so much work on the global plastics treaty, that this fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty is like super interesting, because that would just solve the problem in 8 years.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was any way like humanly possible, right? Like there's and we're definitely not moving to renewables anywhere near fast enough. I mean,
well, yeah, I mean, that's only half of it to say non-proliferation. We do have to replace the energy needs, and build the kind of grid. You need investment, right? That's why Build Back Better bills are important. They have infrastructure investment. You need an EV infrastructure, or we're not going to hit the targets on cars. You need the grid to be much smarter so that you can plug in devices and go back and forth and deal with the intermittency of solar and wind. So we can't just say, don't use fossil fuels, right? Like there has to be the investment to replace it, to fulfill our energy needs.
And a just transition for all these jobs, for sure.
Exactly.
I mean, it's
right. And we should take care of the industries that are going under. I mean, the coal miners and the frackers, and we should be finding ways to provide for them. And I think we have the money. The country has the money to do that. Clearly, we spent trillions on response to the pandemic. The world spent 20 trillion, something like that. So the money's there. We can do this.
So I want to finish up with two questions. First, what's keeping you up at night the most? Second, what are you most optimistic about? We'll end on the optimism.
It's funny, I've been doing so many interviews since the book launched, and almost everyone has some version of what are you optimistic about at the end. We're living in hard times, and I think pretending we're not is not helpful, right? I mean, it's just it kind of seems like you're out of touch. And I realized recently, like I've given talks for years, and so many, and I don't know, there's a lot of jokes, and I've realized there's not as much funny in my talks. And I'm like, we're not living in a funny time. So it's just, things are serious, and we've got real challenges, and it's tough for our kids to kind of grow up in this. So what keeps me up at night is that kind of thing, the effect on society, effect on my kids, of the pandemic, of, burgeoning climate change. But the real thing is the demise of democracy in the US. It's profoundly dangerous what's going on. The coup attempt of a year ago really has continued. And there's tremendously successful efforts at the state level to make voting harder, to give state legislatures the right to decide the election, which is not a democracy. And it may be almost too late. I think we're in a lot of trouble in the US. And so and it does tie to all my work, because it's going to be pretty hard to tackle climate change or inequality if the U.S., the biggest economy, is in an autocracy, and one heavily influenced, frankly, by white supremacy. Right? We're not going to have an equal society or a just society when we're led by white supremacists, frankly, or influenced by them. And so it's a really dangerous time. And I kind of encourage everyone to spend some effort this year on trying to fight this, and encourage your senators, call them, tell them they got to pass the voting rights bills. We got to protect voting rights. That's the first thing. That keeps me up. It's scary. The optimism part is, there's so much momentum on some of these things globally, that there's stuff that can't be stopped. And the rise of the clean economy, the cost of, clean energy and technologies has dropped so fast. And it's now the cheapest form of energy, and the battery prices have plummeted, and the EVs are getting better, and auto companies have almost all committed to moving to all EVs. Like, the clean economy stuff is hard not to be excited about. And we're going to have a clean grid. We're going to be driving EVs. All that's going to happen. And then I'm also optimistic about kind of young people. The Greta Thunbergs of the world, they're pissed off, but they know how to mobilize. They use technology in ways that, that we don't. I mean, just things like the Korean band BTS kind of getting their fans to call into things or undermine. I mean, like they've engaged people in such interesting, fun ways to try to fight injustice and try to get people to vote and all of that. That's pretty exciting. I mean, we can't rely on 18-year-olds to save us, but they're getting older, getting into voting age, going to be working in the workforce, and they have very strong views on this, no matter what political persuasion, on climate, on inequality. They just believe in a much more just and equitable society, right? They just don't see issues with race, gender. It's just much more, kind of flexible and welcoming and open. So that gives me a lot of hope that my kids basically are going to take care of us in our old age.
My 5-year-old asks, there's this podcast she listens to, like a teenage podcast called the Big Melt.
Wait, your 5-year-old listens to podcasts?
She listens to Earth Rangers, and she listens to the Big Melt, and the Big Melt is just all about climate change, and it's this teenager telling the story of other teenagers, and she asks for it all the time, and I'm like, do you understand what's going on here? And she does, and she totally gets it. It's kind of amazing, and I mean, that certainly gives me a ton of hope. I mean, I think it's like the interesting sort of dynamic, and this is like Katharine Hayhoe is like, this is like at the peak, like when there's no hope, people just put their head in the sand.
Right.
There's just like, when there's no hope, which is, sometimes it's hard to find it with what's going on, that like people just tune out, because if you're going to get hit by the asteroid, and you can, nothing you can do about it, then what else, but if there's hope, then you can get action, and you can start to catalyze change. And I think that's and there's what gets me up and moving in the morning.
There's not like a cliff where if we don't stop it at 1.5 degrees, we all die. Like there's a fight worth having kind of wherever we are on this journey. The situation gets worse the more we allow warming to happen, but wherever we are it's worth fighting to get cleaner and reduce footprint. So, I think there's always a reason to be fighting and not just throw in the towel. That's ridiculous. It's just, what's the point of that? That's no fun either. I mean, like, why live like that? That doesn't sound, interesting at all. It's better go down fighting, right?
Right. Better to turn these aircraft carriers around and point them in the right direction, and make sure they're fighting the good fight with us. And you've dedicated your career doing just that and a whole lot more, Andrew. And I'm just so grateful to be able to have you on today and be able to deep dive and net positive. You can get it on Amazon. You can listen to it on Audible, and probably just about a million other places. But thanks so much for your time today, my friend. And we're super excited. And we're going to be back next Tuesday with Katharine Hayhoe. One of them, we've talked a lot about her today, but one of the I would say most renowned climate scientists of our time. So thank you so much. And we'd love to have you back sooner than later.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a great day. Thanks so much.